All right, good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to the CSG eCademy webinar. Today's session on human trafficking seeks to provide legislators, their staffs, and other interested groups with information on efforts to improve state laws on this critical human and civil rights issue. My name is Jack Cobb. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with CSG's Washington, D.C. office. I'm going to tell you about our speakers in just a moment, but before I do that, just a quick note on how the webinar will run. Each speaker will present, and at the end we will have open Q&A. If you have a question for a speaker, you may type it directly into the GoToWebinar interface at any time. We will collect these and ask as many as we can at the time that allows at the end of the webinar. As I mentioned, the focus of today's webinar is state efforts to combat human trafficking. While slavery is a violation of a person's civil rights and prohibited by the Constitution, modern human trafficking is a widespread and complex problem that involves physical and psychological abuse and control of victims. Efforts to fight human trafficking range from international law enforcement to specialized training for flight attendants to identify potential victims. This afternoon we'll get two perspectives on state-level legislative efforts to develop a modern legal framework and policies to address human trafficking. We'll hear from Senator Julie Rosen about her work in the Minnesota Senate to improve that state's statutes and programs. But first, we'll hear from Anita Ramastri, who is a professor of law at the University of Washington School of Law, where she serves as the faculty director of the International, Transnational, and Comparative Law programs. Anita has held a number of appointments and published many articles on issues at the intersection of human rights and trade. Her work has also included federal government service leading anti-corruption trade programs at the International Trade Administration. She has also served as a senior advisor to the Institute for Human Rights and Business. And she will be speaking to us today about her work and on behalf of the Uniform Law Commission, where she is the chairwoman of the executive committee. Established in 1892, the Uniform Law Commission provides states with nonpartisan, well-conceived, and well-drafted legislation that brings clarity and stability to critical areas of state law. We're grateful to have Senator Rosen and Professor with us, and I will remind you to please submit any questions directly into the GoToWebinar interface, and we will address those at the end. And now I'll turn things over to Anita.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack. It's a pleasure to speak to you all today. I'm really here not in my academic capacity, but in my capacity as a representative of the Uniform Law Commission. As Jack mentioned, I am chair of our executive committee, but I had the honor of being the co-chair of a 2-year drafting project of the Uniform Law Commission focused on a uniform act on the prevention of and remedies for human trafficking. That project concluded in 2013. So my purpose today is really to give you an overview of the act, why the ULC engaged in this drafting project, and to talk about the resources we have available for state legislators if they're interested in the act in whole or in part, and I'll explain what I mean by that. We engaged in this project, and many of you might be familiar with the Uniform Law Commission because we engage, draft acts focusing on anything like trusts and estates and the Uniform Commercial Code. So trafficking was a bit of a novel topic for us, but the American Bar Association came to us in 2011 in cooperation with LexisNexis and really was focused on the need at the state level to update and modernize laws dealing with human trafficking. I think there's been a greater awareness of the magnitude of the problem here in the United States, and also focusing on the need for harmonization, that uniform law in this area would allow law enforcement to cooperate more proactively, but also would mean that criminals wouldn't be able to look for and operate in jurisdictions that had laxer laws, so that harmonization would really create a greater standard for law enforcement and also would provide victims with uniform protections throughout the country. So with that in mind, we engaged in a 2-year process, and it was a very robust one with key observers, not only from law enforcement. NAG was very active in the drafting process, but lots of the trafficking advocacy groups were also involved, and the Polaris Project, which until very recently actually analyzed and rated states in terms of the adequacy of their laws. you'll see on the first slide that there is a website or a web page that we've created in addition to the normal Uniform Law Commission resources, the Let's End Human Trafficking. And if you go to that page, you'll see a variety of things, including a legislative enactment kit, resources, summaries of the act itself. So that's a great place to just see what we do and what we have available. The act has really three key parts, and that's what I want to mention to you today. Many states do have some laws on the books, but as we discovered during the drafting process, they were all over the map. And so we created a law that we thought would provide states with what they needed and what was missing. Some states needed more comprehensive overhauls because they hadn't had the opportunity to enact recent legislation, and other states were at different stages in dealing with what I call modernization and updating of their trafficking legislation. So our three parts, the first really focuses on criminal penalties, and more states obviously had something on the books dealing with criminal law. But what we discovered was that the area of labor trafficking, which is I think where there's greater focus now in addition to sex trafficking, is an area where there was greater disparity. So we created a statute that not only has penalties for sex trafficking, but has penalties for labor trafficking as well. And so it's a unified statute that gives prosecutors tools across the board. The second thing we realized was that the area of coercion, because again, trafficking relates to a crime where someone is forced into slavery, was that traditional criminal definitions of coercion hadn't been updated to reflect what we were learning or the ways in which traffickers engaged in forcing their victims into trafficking. So we have a broader definition of coercion that includes, for example, providing people with controlled substances and getting them addicted as a means of getting them involved with trafficking, and also the issue which has actually happened in a variety of states, which is abuse of individuals who, because of a mental impairment or vulnerability, so disability, it wouldn't have the capacity to consent, so that traditional definitions of coercion didn't work. So those are just some examples of things that we did to update the kind of criminal law provisions. We also have additional provisions focusing on issues of patronizing minors for commercial sexual activity. So again, focusing on the issue of youth as a vulnerable population. So I'm not going to go into the details any further, but just to say that the first part of the Act focuses on criminal law and updating that. The second part of the Act is really, I think, the more novel area where we really found that there was a greater need for the states to have new law, and that was really on victims' protection, so that in addition to criminal prosecution, that there be a parallel set of victim-centered provisions that focused on things like confidentiality to provide safe and secure means for law enforcement to cooperate with victims, certain types of immunity for minors that might actually be trafficking victims in terms of their own prosecution for non-offenses, an affirmative defense for victims of trafficking, that they were victims to the extent that they might be arrested for prostitution, and a right of civil action against traffickers. And this is a new area where I think lawyers are working with victims to actually engage in civil litigation. So the victims protection basket is, I think, where we've seen the greatest movement of different states in terms of looking at their own laws and saying, what have we not done and that we could do to protect victims. And the third part of the Act focused really on what we call public awareness. And so this section focused on providing states with a blueprint for what they could do in terms of coordination among different parts of state agencies. So the idea of a human trafficking council, the use of public awareness signs, and the National Trafficking Hotline phone number, grants to victim services agencies, and so forth. So that third section is really more about public awareness and state coordination. So those are the different parts of the Act, and just to close, and I'm happy to answer questions, different states have, Delaware was one of the first to deal with this. It took the whole Act and enacted it wholesale. Other states that we've worked with have needed only parts, and so we've been happy to work actively with legislators and their staff just on introducing segments of the Act where needed. And what we are able to do with states is that we have in a brochure, and if you could just, next slide. I'm just waiting for the, you'll see here, this is just a copy of both information that's on our website and a very simple brochure that we have created. Is that on the right side of that sort of trifold that you see there is a checklist, which basically lists all of the key sections of our Act. And we're able to work with states to identify and assess their existing laws and give them comparison charts to say, where do you already have existing provisions in your legislation and what's missing? So the checklist and some of the research that we're willing to do, I think, gives people an at-a-glance look at, what's the current state of your law. And the next page, again, is just more information, if we look at the next slide, from our website. So I just hope that this is a chance for us to say we have these resources for you. We're happy to work with you to figure out what your state needs, and then to work to see, again, how your law compares at the moment with what we came up with as kind of current generation best practice in this area. So thanks again, and hopefully we can be of assistance to you in the future.
Great, thank you very much. So unfortunately, I've heard from Senator Rosenstaff. She's running a few minutes behind, so we will go to questions for Anita now while the Senator gets connected. So if anybody has questions on the ULC or human trafficking work, please send those in. We have two to start off. The first question, Anita, is do most states, is their sort of current issue a lack of existing law or a need to reform? Do most states sort of need to create something from scratch, or do they need to reform and improve existing laws?
And so I think it's really the latter. It's the supplementation. As I mentioned, there are some states that really had very little law in the books, and we've worked more actively with those states to create the whole architecture. But for other states, they have criminal laws on the books. And so, traditional criminal penalties, especially in the area of sex trafficking. So what we've really done is, in the area of criminal law, there's often a need to just update and augment. So, for example, looking at the definition of coercion, looking at whether there are specific criminal penalties that are focusing on minors, or whether there's a need for specific penalty for patronizing a trafficking victim as opposed to just an issue of patronizing in the area of prostitution. And then labor trafficking, again, often the definitions of forced labor in old statutes tended to be outdated. So that's one thing. Where really states have needed new law is in that second basket, which is the victim's protection, just because what it is that would help victims, both in terms of things like a right for civil action, the right to have their criminal records expunged if they were previously convicted of a crime, but were actually trafficked. Those are the things I think that are where new law is needed, and so we've been pleased to see that movement by states in that second basket. And the third, I think, really just depends on whether states have the inclination and resources, which is really about coordination and public awareness. And there, I think we're just saying to states, here's a menu of best practices in terms of how a state and its state entities can best address the issue.
Great, and I think probably a somewhat related question is, how does the Uniform Law Commission, I guess for those who aren't familiar, how does the ULC work with states? And you mentioned it can sort of help legislatures develop or sort of revise or improve laws. How does the ULC work with states, sort of either specifically on this issue or more broadly?
Yeah, so the Uniform Law Commission, of course, is actually an organization for the states, but it's a membership organization of the states. So any state will have what are called commissioners, and these are people who are appointed. Each state has its own appointment structure, but essentially lawyers that may include legislators. So legislators, judges, academics, private practitioners will often be appointed and be members of the National Uniform Law Commission on behalf of their states and participate in drafting these acts through a drafting process. So we had representatives of different states who were commissioners on the drafting committee that created this Uniform Act. Once the act is approved by the Uniform Law Commission, we just finished our annual meeting this year, for example, once the commissioners approve the act, our commissioners, so again, people from each of your states, will go back and will often work to seek enactment of different uniform laws in their own home jurisdictions. So that's one route, which is that we have commissioners who represent the states who will very often be ones to help introduce and bring legislation to the states. The second is just that to the extent that there are other legislators that have an interest in this, both the commissioners and then we have a staff in Chicago, we create legislative enactment kits. So we have one for the Trafficking Act. We have some legislative counsel on staff. We provide detailed comparisons of each, if a state wants it, of their existing legislation and the Uniform Act, and can then provide material and even to the extent needed help with testimony or answering questions of stakeholders in a state just to help advance. So we've done any number of things in different states.
Great, and we had a sort of, again, a follow-up question. Does the ULC work with nonprofits and other organizations, as well as sort of what resources does it provide to legislators? I think you just spoke to how you all work with legislators. Perhaps you could sort of speak to how you all work with nonprofits and other sort of policy advocates.
Sure, and we work in different ways, and the strength of the Uniform Law Commission is that we are a nonpartisan organization that is, comprised of states as members. So our goal is to produce good legislation when there is a need for uniformity across state lines, and so trafficking was an area, trafficking prevention, where we thought that was the case. We work with organizations, nonprofit, advocacy, and others in different ways. One is that our drafting process is very transparent and open. So we take 2 years to draft uniform legislation, with drafting committees meeting at least twice per year during that process. And so organizations that are interested stakeholders in it, again, we work in many different topics, be it family law, trusts and estates, or this one, trafficking, where people can sign up as observers to either do something low maintenance, which is just receive copies of the drafts and know what's going on, or other people come and actually sit at the table as observers and participate actively in the drafting process by providing their expertise and input as we craft legislation. So that's one. To the extent that there's an interest in enactment of trafficking legislation, we've had different experiences in different states. So in some states, it's been the legislature or the Attorney General's office that's really wanted to move legislation. In other states, it's been a coalition often, which may involve government entities, but also involving trafficking advocates who do want to see legislative change, and they'll contact us. And again, we're happy to provide input, guidance, and information to nonprofits and other organizations too. Although again, we can't align ourselves in any particular way with a specific advocacy group. Our job is just to equip people with what we have as what we believe is well-crafted legislation.
Great. We have a question, I guess, if you could speak to it. It sounds like perhaps there's a bit of a misunderstanding or sort of an assumption that these crimes are sort of already covered by federal law. Maybe if you have some background, are you able to speak to sort of what federal law does cover, or sort of where the white space that states need to fill in or cover this issue is?
And I think the white space is just that, yeah, federal law does cover much of the trafficking, but it's just a matter of capacity. And so to the extent that a U.S. Attorney's Office, DOJ, will engage in prosecution at the federal level, they really do rely on this sort of cooperative effort in the area and do rely on states to engage in prosecution as well. Labor trafficking is an area that's brand new for both the feds and the states in terms of actual engagement, so that's an area where I think, again, it's just a matter of who has the ability and to go after that. But in the area of sex trafficking, much of what we've seen in terms of activity, my state, Washington, was one of the very first to engage in more active both lawmaking in the area, but then enforcement. It's really been the states prosecutors who've been driving and the county prosecutors who've been driving more of the action. So I think, as you've seen in many criminal areas, obviously drug crimes, similar thing. There's federal law, there's state law, but the magnitude of the problem is such that the feds really want that state cooperation as well.
Excellent. And then you had mentioned that one of the areas where you've seen sort of the most interest from states was protection for victims. How does that sort of play in with the penalties issue, where you have people are sort of forced into committing crimes, then as you sort of mentioned in some cases trying to get records expunged? Or what are some of the details of how that works out, and how are states sort of shifting their view of this?
Well, states are shifting, I think, because again, there's been a greater understanding, especially in the area of sex trafficking, as we've come to understand that this is a problem that's not just about people being trafficked in from other countries, but is just a phenomena in our own backyard, even relating to especially minors within our own state boundaries. That there's just been this greater focus on not treating the victim as a criminal, but understanding that these are people that do need assistance, and that the assistance will also lead to greater cooperation with law enforcement. So the clearest area where the Act deals with victims' protections is on the issue of, to the extent that there is a potential arrest, or in the past there was an arrest of someone who was actually a trafficking victim, that person has a right to seek a vacation of that conviction, because again, there was no crime per se if the person was coerced into that action. Our Act does go a little bit further in the sense that it does provide for an affirmative defense that for victims that goes beyond the crime of prostitution and focuses on non-violent offenses that may also be, relate to a person being a victim and coerced into committing a petty crime. And again, those are areas where states can modify their laws as they see fit. We don't tell them, what other nonviolent offenses might be ripe or appropriate for providing any kind of affirmative defense to a victim, or providing an ability for a motion to vacate. But the larger theme, and again, this is one where we saw it very actively, a lot of law enforcement that provided comments on the draft really did subscribe to this victim-centered approach to legislative drafting.
Excellent. Thank you. I think those are all the questions we have at the moment. We are still waiting for the Senator.
I'm on.
If we could, wonderful.
I am here, Jack. Yes, I've been, my apologies. I just got back from a funeral of a fellow senator, so I'm frantically running around trying to get organized here, and apparently I'm not too organized. Sorry. But very sad day.
We're very sorry to hear about that, but it does make us even more appreciative that you've made time to join us today. As a brief introduction, Senator Rosen has served in the Minnesota Senate since 2002, and she is currently the ranking member of the Health and Human Services Budget Committee, as well as holding leadership roles in detention and health and human services and housing committees. Senator Rosen has fought to improve state law on human trafficking for years. Her work has focused not just on criminal penalties, as Anita discussed, but as well as providing increased funding for programs that help prevent and take care of victims of this crime. So we're very happy and excited to have Senator Rosen with us to try to help bring a bit of practice and implementation to the best practice and research that the ULC has done. So with that, thank you again, Senator, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and again, my apologies for being tardy. Actually, I am in the minority, but we do tend to work on a particular issue like this very succinctly with the majority, and Senator Sandy Pappas, she is also now the president of the Senate, has been very, very active in this whole human trafficking issue too. This year was a bonding year, but in our supplemental finance bill, we put $33,000 for the Safe Harbors program that we developed in 2011. So we put $33,000 for 2017 and $1.5 million for the next budget coming up. But just to go back just a little bit, I think Minnesota has been very proactive and has done a good job with getting grassroots activism and some innovative legal reform. Back in '05, we started the first anti-trafficking statute, and that defined sex and labor trafficking and created a civil liability law for trafficking victims. Also, the St. Paul Police Department received its first Department of Justice grant to begin the Gerald D. Vick Human Trafficking Task Force. And that task force went strong under the guidance of the Public Safety and the Department of Health until 2011, but it has continued, even though that wasn't funded ongoing, it has continued, so that was good. In 2009, the Minnesota statutes were amended to specifically define sex trafficking as a crime and provide for increased penalties. So the law does not require the use of force, fraud, or coercion by traffickers to establish the crime of sex trafficking. And this means that the consent of the individual used in prostitution does not constitute the defense to promotion of prostitution. Also, in 2011, we passed the Safe Harbors for Sexually Exploited Youth law, and that, I believe, probably received 100% of all the legislators' votes. It was specifically for youth under the age of 16, and creates a mandatory first-time diversion for any 16 or 17-year-old who has been exploited in prostitution, and adds the definition of sexually exploited youth to Minnesota's Child Protection Code. It increases penalties against commercial sex offenders and directs the Commissioner of Public Safety to create a victim-centered response for sexually exploited youth. That was in 2011. We did create the Safe Harbor in 2013, which we put $2.8 million in. $2 million was from the Department of Health and Human Services, and $800,000 from Public Safety for training for our law enforcement, and we have continued to keep that commitment to our law enforcement for training, and I think a total of about $11 million we've put in since the very beginning. So the budget basically created a statewide director of child sex trafficking prevention at the Department of Health. It also created 6 regional navigator positions to connect sexually exploited youth throughout the state with shelter, support, and services that they need. $700,000 is training fund that's been set up for law enforcement, prosecutors, and others, and then $100,000 to compensate some local law enforcement for sending personnel to trainings, which I think we could talk about and do a better job of that, and $1 million for safe harbor housing and shelter. And so we've been very committed to that part of it, is the housing part of it. We received I believe we were one of 21 states that received a Tier 1 ranking with the Polaris Project, but we were deficient on, there is no legislation requiring a statewide human trafficking task force, even though that has been ongoing. We got penalized for not having it in statute. And nor does Minnesota have any legislation allowing sex trafficking victims the opportunity to expunge prostitution-related convictions. So those are probably 2 of the areas that we need to work on. But I'm a senator from Greater Minnesota, and we talk a lot about the differences and the differences of approach, how the law enforcement has to approach it for Greater Minnesota versus the metro area. That has become glaringly obvious that we perhaps have to do some things differently to get to these kids that are either trafficked for sex or for labor. And everybody's aware of that. So it's a statewide problem, but a lot of the money has been focused into the metro area, and we're trying to get it out as best as possible to the areas in Greater Minnesota. Jack? Hello?
Excellent. Thank you, Senator. We want to get some questions now that folks have sent in. As a reminder, if you use the chat tab on your GoToWebinar, you can send the questions in. We'll get to as many of them as time allows. The first one, Senator, if you could probably sort of help articulate a bit on your experience when you worked on human trafficking-specific legislation. Many issues associated with human trafficking, such as kidnapping, prostitution, forced labor, these things are already illegal. Why was a very specific bill necessary, and how did you sort of communicate that need to your colleagues?
Well, actually, as I said, Senator Pappas was the lead on this, and she was very passionate about it, and it did take strong leadership because I believe we've funded it quite well. And like I said, she is a Metro legislator from St. Paul, and I'm a Greater Minnesota. So a lot of the funds were being funneled, or there was attention mostly on the Metro. That was probably our biggest hurdle, is how are you going to get the funds appropriately dispensed out into the rural parts of the state where there is homelessness, there is sex trafficking, there is all of the above. It's going across state line borders. It's within all the various. We have a large number of Indian, Native American reservations. We're seeing a tremendous amount of sex trafficking in that particular area. So we are struggling on how to get this out appropriately. But I think to deal with your question is, you just have to hear a couple stories. It's the same thing as the child protection. It always just takes one story, one headline, and all of a sudden we stand up and we listen and we bring in the best, and it's not a partisan issue at all. It becomes, okay, what do we need to do to get our hands around this? Unfortunately, it always takes one terrible incident, and we finally, straighten up.
Excellent. And then, Anita, perhaps are you able to assist in sort of understanding on the sort of technical statute side, what does the ULC's proposed legislation address that is not already covered by a sort of other ancillary or secondary criminal statutes?
Oh, so if I'm understanding that question correctly, Jack, is the question focused just on the criminal piece?
Yes, on the criminal piece, sort of how does the proposed legislation, if many of the things such as forced labor, prostitution, kidnapping, what does the proposed legislation address that sort of makes it necessary in addition to those existing laws?
Right, and so in terms of the criminal part, so again, sort of part one of the act, the area of forced labor, for example, how and what type of coercion is involved in forced labor is an area where older state statutes didn't really deal with much of the issues, for example, kind of current or modern forms of debt bondage, for example. So we I think, updated the forced labor kind of criminal provisions. The area of coercion, as I mentioned again, there's a broader definition of coercion that provides states with the tools to the extent that, again, how people are coerced into trafficking isn't just through kind of the traditional threats and violence, but also through means of, for example, drug and substance abuse, addiction, the issue of people who are vulnerable and may have a disability where coercion is not about consent per se. We have new provisions that focus on knowingly patronizing someone who is a trafficking victim, so an enhanced penalty, and similarly patronizing a minor for commercial sexual activity. We also do have a section that focuses on business liability, and this one is one that we carefully crafted with employers and the private sector involved in it, because again, of course, I think sometimes people think, well, why would you go after a company? And of course, there are some companies that are knowingly profiting from forced labor in a variety of contexts, and so we do have that type of a provision as well. So a variety of things, and also even how one calculates criminal restitution if a trafficker is convicted. We found that many of the existing state laws were inadequate in terms of how to deal with that issue.
Great. And we've had a question for Senator Rosen. The ULC has said that one of their third pillars is on public awareness and coordination. The question is sort of how, after obviously sort of getting the legislature to approve funding and get the programs, the support they need from the legislature, are you able to speak to sort of how the executive branch or the people that implement the program, how do they make sure it reached to the people? How do they raise awareness? How do they actually get into the communities that needed them?
Well, we did create the statewide director for child sex trafficking, and that was back in 2013. In 2014, the governor created the Child Protection Task Force, and there was only 2 senators and 2 House members, Republican, Democrat, and we started with that and tore apart all the child protection laws and rebuilt them. it was a tremendous amount of work. We came out with 99 recommendations, and we've gotten about 5 done since then. But the statewide director for child sex trafficking, he, of course, was on the task force, and we started creating, a conversation of how to best get this out. And I do believe, I feel very strongly about this, the program at the Safe Harbors that was created, and within that is a state service model called No Wrong Door, and that makes resources available and services for these sexually exploited youth that include the regional navigators that go out into greater Minnesota, into the urban and the metro area, the rural and the metro area, and that also looks for housing and shelter, because that's a very important piece, is that housing and shelter part. Is where we're going to put these children that are going to be safe, away from just the normal type of shelter, because they can be exploited anywhere. And so we have to create shelters and places where they felt safe. And then we could provide comprehensive services, whether it's for continued shelter, or whether it's some mental health services. And we also had to create more training for our law enforcement and a better protocol when you come across a child or a 16-year-old that you think has been exploited. What do you do? A lot of the law enforcement in all areas of the state have not had that training. I would like to see it go even farther with the training and use ITV, because I know our law enforcement agencies are stretched, and you add child protection in that, and you add the whole issue with mental health. The courts, our counties are getting stretched to the max. If you were able to train your law enforcement through ITV, telemedicine per se, I think we could really reach a lot more areas. But that's my opinion. I don't have a bill written on it yet, but I think I will. So it was really a matter of, as I said, just a couple incidences that we decided to look across the state. What resources do we have? Where are the weak links? And Mr. Jeff Bauer, who is the gentleman who is in charge of the sex trafficking task force and program, he has just been wonderful. And usually when he comes to the Capitol and sits in front of our committee and explains why he needs expanded housing, what he's going to do with the money, we normally give it to him, because he's very, very passionate and very good.
Great, and we actually have sort of 2 follow-up questions regarding the commission that you were serving on. I guess first on the commission's representation, did it include, you mentioned there were 2 senators, did it also include your sort of state and local law enforcement, or who was on that group?
Yeah. Oh yes, it included representatives from social workers, the county attorneys. It had the Chief Justice on there. It had the advocates for, like, the Children's Defense advocates. We had of course law enforcement from the Twin Cities and also from Greater Minnesota. It was very, very well represented. It had the experts, Dr. Mark Hudson, who was a doctor in emergency room. We had several doctors in emergency rooms that deal specifically on child-related abuse. We had some of the experts, and we had, of course, we had judges. Oh boy, who else am I missing? We didn't miss anybody. And then we broke up into 3 separate subgroups, and we worked for 9 months, about 2 or 3 times a month. We got together and worked pretty much all day on these recommendations and got together. And I'm very proud of that work, but it's been difficult, especially with some of the racial disparity issues and some of the issues surrounding our Native American community. So we've had to make some adjustments with that also. Am I answering the question okay? I hope so.
Yes. And then there was also the question towards sort of the special commission versus committee work, and how did that divide? Did you think were both necessary, or was it sort of important to get out of the existing legislative structure and bring in all those outside people, and that's what made this possible?
Oh, absolutely. A total tear down of your system and build back up. And of course, we have a situation here where I believe the rural counties were doing the best that they could with their child protection system with the money that was provided. In Minnesota, we're supposed to be providing enough money for the counties. That's how we're set up. And then you also had Hennepin County, which is Minneapolis. Their system was completely different than how the rural counties were dealing with their child protection. So it has been we're addressing the entire system across the state. It's been a little difficult. It's been very, very, besides time-consuming, it's been very emotional. And now we're trying to build it back up, and we're trying to provide the money to the counties and to the system to build up and be able to protect these children. But we're facing these obstacles, such as we don't have enough social workers. There's a shortage of social workers all across the state. And so you create loan forgiveness programs, and you try to go to the higher ed institutions, say you got to ramp this up, you got to get more people in, but can we do it fast enough? And how many victims are going to fall, between the cracks? And so that's what we're struggling with, is that we've just got some very serious issues that have been difficult. But when it was time to bring these recommendations forward to the committees, first to our committees at the legislature, very well received, very well received. And then it was governor and legislature, you have to put your money where your mouth is. And we did. We put about $50 million going towards the counties for child protection to help them, improve on their assessing and their training and the whole bit.
Excellent. Thank you for that sort of information, how you went about that. If we could circle back, I believe Anita had a comment to sort of help understand a bit of the safe harbor work.
Yeah, and just to commend the senator, because Minnesota was early to deal with this, and obviously it takes a lot of follow-through and implementation. But both the Uniform Act and then where we're seeing a trend is in this area that the senator referred to as providing a safe harbor, and that really relates to the issue of providing immunity for minors that are commercially sexually exploited, so that they wouldn't be brought into the criminal justice system, but instead provided with opportunities through diversion in states as an alternative. And as you can imagine, when this concept initially began to gain traction, I think there is a lot of question among legislators and law enforcement around the issue of providing immunity for these for youth and for minors. But I think that the tide is turning, and Minnesota's example of sort of not only providing a legislative safe harbor for youth that are commercially sexually exploited, but then actually going through and really doing robust implementation is a model for other states.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we need to not only protect them, we need to provide the services so they can go out and make a life of their own and continue on. You can protect them, you can give them immunity or expunge their record, but then what happens? And we found that in the Child Protection Task Force, all of our attention was on the younger little ones, but there's a whole age group that is getting lost also, and that is the 11 to 18-year-olds, or even beyond that also. And then you could go into the foster care system, and that's a whole other ballgame there. And so, yeah, we have to provide hope for these children that got lost. And at any time in their life they got lost, but we just can't pass them up.
Excellent. So I guess sort of circle back to one of our prior questions as to why specific and specialized legislation is needed to address this issue. Part of it is to help sort of provide a legal mechanism to separate these folks out from, if you have been essentially enslaved, that, you aren't going to be punished for what you were forced to do, as well as, as Senator Rosen pointed out, providing some mechanisms to help them, take their life back and take it in a path that they choose. Well, that is
right.
all.
Thank you for saying that much better than what I did. That's true. That's the truth. Yeah.
Well, thank you all. We are just about out of time, but I want to thank Senator Rosen and Anita again for their participation. I'm sure I speak for all our viewers when saying that the balance between you all of your sort of expertise in both theory and practice is incredibly helpful. Moving forward, this webinar will be archived on the CSG Knowledge Center, So if anybody missed part of this program, or if you would like to recommend it to a friend, or just read it again, or listen to it again, refresh over the coming months as your legislative sessions pick up again in the fall, it will be there, and we encourage you to please continue to make use of it. Please be sure to check the CSG website for information about future eCademy webinars as well. Again, I'm Jack Cobb with CSG's Washington, D.C. office, and I want to thank you all for joining us.